Okay, so you want to buy an oil refinery. Spend a few $1 billion, buy some crude oil, turn it into gasoline and diesel, and wait for the money to roll in. Sounds simple, but here's the strange part. A refinery can make millions of dollars in a single day and still lose hundreds of millions in a bad year. The reason has almost nothing to do with how much oil costs. It comes down to the tiny gap between what you pay for crude and what you can sell the finished fuel for. By the end of this video, you'll know how refineries actually make money, why a few dollars per barrel matters, where the billions disappear, and why some refineries are worth fortunes while others get shut down. Oil refineries come in very different sizes, and that changes the entire business. A small refinery might process around 20,000 barrels of crude every day. That's still enough to supply fuel to a large local market. A mid-sized refinery can process around 100,000 barrels a day, turning millions of gallons of crude into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel every month. Then you have the giants. The Port Arthur refinery in Texas can process more than 600,000 barrels a day. At that scale, you're no longer running a factory. You're running an industrial city. The equipment costs billions, the supply chain stretches across continents, and even a tiny change in profit per barrel can mean hundreds of millions of dollars a year. But buying the refinery is only the beginning. The first cost nobody warns you about is getting permission to operate it. An oil refinery sits under some of the strictest environmental and safety rules in the industrial world. You need permits for emissions, wastewater, storage tanks, hazardous materials, and dozens of other systems. And then there is the equipment itself. A modern refinery can require billions of dollars in upgrades just to meet changing environmental standards. One new emissions rule can turn perfectly working equipment into obsolete equipment. You can own the land, own the refinery, and have plenty of customers waiting for fuel. But without the right permits and safety systems, your billion-dollar machine is basically a very expensive collection of metal. But regulation isn't the only thing that can destroy a refinery. The second wild card is location. A refinery needs crude oil coming in and fuel going out, and both have to be cheap enough to make the math work. That means pipelines, ports, storage tanks, railways, electricity, and nearby customers. Get one piece wrong, and transportation costs can eat the entire refining margin. A refinery sitting next to cheap crude can have a huge advantage. Another refinery hundreds of miles away might pay millions more just to move the same oil. And here's the strange part. Moving a refinery is basically impossible. So when the market changes, you're stuck with the location you chose. In this business, geography can be worth billions. A refinery does not make money by simply owning oil. It makes money by changing what that oil is worth. Imagine buying a barrel of crude for $70. You run it through the refinery and turn that barrel into a collection of products worth $80. You created $10 of gross margin. Now multiply that by 200,000 barrels every day. That's $2 million before paying for electricity, workers, maintenance, transportation, taxes, and everything else. Refiners call this difference the crack spread. And this is the heart of the entire business. The refinery owner is constantly watching two things at the same time. What does crude cost going in? And what are gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel selling for coming out? The gap between them is where the money lives. Here's the part most people get wrong about refineries. They think crude oil goes in and gasoline comes out. It doesn't work that way. One barrel can produce several different products, and each one has its own price. Gasoline might be strong today. Diesel might be stronger tomorrow. Jet fuel could suddenly become more valuable when air travel surges. A refinery operator can adjust the production mix to capture some of those changes. That's why complex refineries are so valuable. They can process different types of crude and produce a wider range of products. The twist is that the refinery isn't chasing oil prices. It's chasing product margins. The best operators constantly move their production toward whatever customers are willing to pay the most for. Now look inside the machine. A refinery is basically a giant industrial city built around one job. Crude oil enters through pipelines or ships, then moves through furnaces, towers, pipes, compressors, and chemical processing units. Some towers are taller than skyscrapers. Thousands of valves and sensors are constantly monitored from control rooms, and almost everything runs around the clock. That's important because a refinery makes money while it is processing barrels. When the plant stops, the revenue stops too. A major shutdown can cost millions of dollars in lost production before you even count the repair bill. That's why refineries schedule maintenance years in advance. The goal isn't simply to build the biggest machine, it's to keep the machine running safely, reliably, and almost non-stop. A refinery also needs something just as important as crude oil: buyers. The biggest refineries don't wait for customers to walk through the door. They build supply relationships with fuel distributors, airlines, trucking companies, gas stations, traders, and industrial companies. Some fuel can be sold through long-term contracts, while other barrels are sold into the open market when prices are better. The same goes for crude. A refinery wants reliable suppliers that can keep the plant fed even when global markets get messy. This creates a hidden advantage. The best refinery isn't just the one with the best equipment, it's the one connected to the best network of suppliers, pipelines, storage terminals, and customers. In this business, relationships can be worth almost as much as steel. And then there are the really big buyers. A refinery doesn't need millions of individual customers. It needs a handful of companies buying enormous amounts of fuel again and again. Airlines need jet fuel. Trucking companies need diesel. Gas station networks need gasoline. Governments need fuel for vehicles, ships, and aircraft. These customers can move thousands or even millions of barrels through the supply chain over time. That's why losing one major customer can hurt more than losing thousands of small ones. But the reverse is also true. Locking in a large buyer can give a refinery predictable demand for years. The refinery still has to watch prices carefully, because a huge customer can negotiate hard. At this scale, one contract can be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So here's the whole refinery business in one sentence. Refining margin multiplied by barrels, processed multiplied by operating days, minus operating costs, maintenance, taxes, and financing. That's it. Every major decision inside the refinery comes back to those numbers. Buy crude cheaply, process as much as safely possible, sell the highest value products, keep the plant running, control costs, and avoid expensive shutdowns. A refinery processing 200,000 barrels a day with a $10 margin looks like a money machine. But if the margin falls to $2, the picture changes completely. The same giant plant can suddenly struggle to cover its costs. That's why refinery owners obsess over margins every morning. The machine is enormous, but the profit lives in a surprisingly small gap between what goes in and what comes out. So why do refineries fail if people always need fuel? Usually, it comes down to debt and bad economics. Take the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery. It was one of the largest refineries on the East Coast, processing around 335,000 barrels a day. But years of financial problems, aging equipment, and weak economics eventually caught up with it. In 2019, a massive fire and explosions tore through the facility. The refinery never reopened. Then there's the Shell Convent refinery in Louisiana. Shell shut it down in 2020 after deciding the aging plant was no longer competitive. These stories show the real danger. A refinery can have enormous capacity and still become worthless when debt, old equipment, safety problems, and weak margins all hit at the same time. So how much can you actually make? Let's use two scenarios. A smaller refinery processing around 50,000 barrels a day might generate hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. If refining margins stay strong and costs are controlled, the owner could potentially make tens of millions in annual profit. Now go to the other extreme. A giant refinery processing around 600,000 barrels a day can generate billions in yearly revenue. In a strong market, profits can reach hundreds of millions of dollars. But here's the catch. Those numbers can swing wildly when margins collapse, equipment breaks, or crude prices move against you. The biggest refinery owners are not simply selling fuel. They're managing one of the world's most expensive machines. In this business, billions can flow through the pipes, but only the margin becomes yours.